This is going to be looking at quote marks. This causes a lot of confusion, especially because sometimes people are unclear when they're supposed to use double quote marks and when they're supposed to use single quote marks. So this video is going to outline what kinds of materials, books, short stories, poems, etc., require quote marks and which italics, and when we should use single quotes as well as double quotes. Just briefly, what we're going to cover today is when to use double quotes, when to use single quotes, and when to use quotes within the context of academic writing for other more anomalous scenarios outside the names of articles or direct quotes from sources. In American publications, when using what's known as primary quotes, double quotes are used. Inversely, when we're talking about the United Kingdom, single quotes are used in the same contexts. So do keep in mind where you're writing, and that will inform when you're using double and single quotes. When do we use primary quotes? Well, we use the primary quotes in two contexts. One, if we're referencing the title of a short work, such as a short story, an article, a poem, a song, or if we're directly quoting somebody. Let's first take a look at the titles, and it's only the titles of short works that get what's known as the primary quotes. The titles of long or independent works will be italicized rather than being given quote marks. Let's take a look at the difference between short works and long works and the ways they get formatted. If you have an article title in a journal or newspaper, the article title will get quotes, but the journal, newspaper, magazine will go in italics. You have a short story, that goes in quotes. If you're citing a novel, that goes in italics. You have a song title, awesome, put that in primary quotes. If you're naming the album that the song is on, that's the large independent work, that will be italicized. Have an episode of a TV show, that goes in quotes. The TV show itself will be in italics. You also have the title of a poem being quotes, but the title of a collection of poems would be in italics. And we see that this is the American formatting, so we are using the double quotes in each of these instances. If we were in the UK, each of those examples would get the single quotes instead of double quotes. Let's take a look at an example. So here we have the best song on Olivia Rodrigo's Sour is Deja Vu. Now in this case, Sour is the name of the album that the song is on. The album is the large independent work. It gets italicized. The title of the song is Deja Vu, and that gets the quote marks. So you'll see the short work has quotes opening and closing the title. Now, this is the American version, and within this context, do note in addition to the quote marks that the period is inside the quote marks. So one of the things that's distinct about the American style of quotation is that periods and commas will go inside the quotes, whether or not they originated from the quote. So do keep that in mind because it's a little different than the UK approach to the same issue. In the United Kingdom, you'll see that the period goes outside the quotes. And you'll see also here, consistent with the style in the UK, is that we have those single quotes as well, rather than the double quotes. So in the UK, the commas and periods only go in the quotes if they're in the source material. Otherwise, they'll go outside. In contrast, in America, primarily because we see this application used in the American Psychological Association APA style guide, the periods and commas will go inside the quotes regardless and irrespective of whether or not they're in the quote in the source material. Here we have another example. My favorite episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation is The Drumhead. So again, here we have the title of the TV show. It's the larger independent work. It gets italicized. The title of the episode we're referring to will be put in primary quotes. Again, you'll see that the quotes open and close that. This is the American style, so we do have the double quotes with the period on the inside. In the United Kingdom, of course, we would use the single quotes, and again, the period would go outside of the quotes. Direct quotes. This is the other instance in which we use primary quotes. So anytime you take 3 significant words or more from a source in sequence, you must use quote marks in that context. You have to show that those words and that sequence belong to another person and came from another source. Keep in mind the criteria here, there must be at least 3 words, first and foremost. They must be significant words as well. So that's 3 significant words or more in a row. It is not. Do we need to put quote marks around these 3 words? Because we do have 3 words. The significant part is we look at each word. We got a pronoun here, not a significant word. We have a negation here, also not a significant word. And then we finally have a simple verb is. Now, in each of these contexts, these are not significant words in and of themselves. Obviously, they can have an impact on interpretation and meaning and semantics, but as they stand, not significant words, and therefore we do not have to put quote marks around them. Thus, in the text, it would simply appear as the words, it is not, without quote marks of any kind. The stationary store is moving. Should we put this in order? We have a couple words here like the and is. Those two words aren't terribly significant, but we do have stationary, store, and moving. Those are significant words. There's three of them. There's three or more words. So now we're going to put them in direct quotes because it is three significant words or more. Example, as Groucho Marx says, quote, I don't want to belong to any club that would accept people like me as a member, end quote. Because we have three significant words or more, because we're taking them directly from somebody else, we open and close that passage with direct quotes. And if we were in the United Kingdom, that direct quote would go in single quotes. So you'll often see, for example, in English novels, when there's dialogue between two people, single quotes are used to open and close the dialogue rather than double quotes, which we would see in American publications. Special note, check the guidelines for the setting and referencing style you're using to determine, first, what parts of the author's names are required. Different setting and referencing styles might require the full name for the first citation, maybe the surname exclusively, so determine that. Also determine whether or not you need to include the publication date for your quote. Some setting referencing styles require that, others do not. Whether you need a page number and how to format each piece of information. Some styles will require a comma between the author's name and the page number, others do not. Query, if there are primary quotes, does that mean that there are secondary quotes? Kind of, and you can see even within the question, I used single quotes around two words, primary and secondary, to kind of question the perspective in that context. And that is one of the examples where we have something that you might refer to informally as secondary quotes. So secondary quotes come in one of four contexts. The ironic quotes, which we just use for primary and secondary, in which we're kind of questioning the perspective of the word being used. Introductory quotes, when we're introducing a term. Signifying quotes, when we're identifying that we're talking about a certain word, not using it. And finally, colloquial quotes, when we have an idiom of some sort that we're using that we might want to denote to the reader is not our wording specifically, we might use quotes for that. Now, a special note, while single or double quotes can be used in each of these instances, regardless of whether or not you're writing in America or the UK, you must be consistent with how you treat them throughout your paper. So do be consistent. If you decide to use single quotes, use them throughout. A recommendation, and this is a recommendation, not a hard and fast rule. I have checked setting and referencing guides, and I can't really find firm rules on how to handle these. But if you use double quotes for your primary quotes, I recommend using single quotes for your secondary quotes. And we would invert that, of course, if you're using single quotes for your primary quotes, use double quotes for the secondary quotes. This can help avoid confusion between them, though it's not a hard and fast rule. I prefer using single quotes for secondary sources if I'm using double quotes for primary ones, so that the reader will not be confused and will be able to differentiate between them and not necessarily anticipate a citation where one is not forthcoming. Let's begin with the ironic quotes. Ironic quotes often call into question the perspective of a specific word. These quotes suggest that the author may not agree with the particular word choice, and we see this oftentimes in academia, especially with antiquated legislation and colonial policies that use words like Indian, where Aboriginal, Indigenous, or First Nations might be more applicable. We might use ironic quotes to call attention to the problematic language of the source material. Example, according to some, I do not act normal. Now, in this context, a person making the claim or quoting the perspective does not agree with the use of the word normal and so puts ironic quotes around it to call into question that perspective. And this might sound a little silly, but within the context of statistics, norm and normal are academic terms that have very specific definitions that can be problematic because they also have social connotations to them that carry a lot of stigma with them. Therefore, when discussing those terms, they can be problematic and it might be necessary to put ironic quotes around it. Another example, some suggest that the APA should change post-traumatic stress disorder to post-traumatic stress response. In this case here, we can see the word disorder is put in single quotes to denote the fact that it might not necessarily be a disorder, to question that perspective. Being exposed to a traumatic event and developing a coping mechanism to a very real threat, not a perceived threat or a phobia of some sort, isn't necessarily your brain in disorder, but rather your brain organizing a very real and pertinent threat. So the word response in this context might be more appropriate. Here, the ironic quotes are questioning that perspective. Introductory quotes. Are you using a term that your reader may not be familiar with? In this context, it's sometimes helpful to offset the first usage of that term with quote marks before a definition. Once the term is introduced, though, there's no need for quote marks afterwards. Example, for your eyebrows to be, quote, on fleek, end quote, they must be systematically and impeccably groomed. Now, in this context, the reader might not be familiar with the phrase on fleek, so you offset that in quotes and then provide a definition. And moving forward, when you use that term without quotes, the reader will know exactly what that term means. Inversely, we might say Schadenfreude means to take joy in others' pain. It's a German word, but this is a no Schadenfreude zone, so we do not take joy in others per Ted Lasso. Signifying quotes. This one's a little confusing. When talking about words as they function, offsetting the signifiers, the words that we're talking about, can help avoid confusion. Now let's take a look at an example that clarifies this. Example, what is a word comprised of 4 letters, yet is made up of 3? Now, in this context, we see the word what at the beginning of the sentence, and because of conventional structure and grammatical rules, we anticipate that this is going to be a question. However, if you carefully look at the punctuation, you'll see there's a semicolon here and a question mark here, meaning that this is not a question, it is a statement. However, without noticing the punctuation, you might misinterpret that and not realize that we're talking about words, not using them, and we're confused about that because of their placement. What is a word comprised of 4 letters, yet is made up of 3? Because the words what and yet are now offset with quotes, the reader recognizes that we're not using these words as they function within the sentence typically, but rather talking about how they function as signifiers. Their placement at the beginning of these 2 clauses is confusing because this is where they would normally be placed when they're being used in their proper context. What would be at the beginning and yet would be linking a second clause with an initial clause. Now that they've been offset, the reader knows exactly what we're talking about. WHAT is 4 letters, YET is 3, easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Colloquial quotes. When using idioms or colloquialisms, it might be a good idea to use quote marks if there are 3 or more significant words. Why? Well, note 1, using single quotes differentiates them from direct quotes. So if your reader's not familiar with the idiom, they might think that you're quoting somebody and therefore expect a citation. Second point here, it's ill-advised to use colloquialisms in your academic writing as they're considered informal. So if you do use them, you want to offset them to perhaps show that you're talking about them or to underscore that they're being used figuratively, although my recommendation is to just avoid them outright. Now let's take a look at some examples of how this might come into play. Example, as they say, if my grandmother had wheels, she'd be a bicycle. Now this is a peculiar phrase that's used in various places around the world. The reader might not be familiar with it. And if you put it in double quotes, it looks like it's a quote from somebody and they might expect a citation. But if you use single quotes to offset it as a secondary quote, then the reader will be clear, oh, this is just an idiom of some sort. So let's do a quick summary. Primary quotes are used in 2 instances, direct quotes and the titles of short works. In America, primary quotes go in double quote marks and periods and commas will always go inside those quote marks. The United Kingdom, inversely, uses single quote marks for primary quotes, and they only put periods and commas in the quote if they were actually in the quote to begin with. Secondary quotes, which is an informal phrase, by the way, this is not an official term, includes ironic quotes, those ones where we're questioning perspective, introductory quotes, where we're introducing a term for the first time and perhaps defining it immediately afterwards, signifying quotes, when we're trying to articulate, we're talking about a word as it functions as a signifier and not using the word in our sentence. And finally, the colloquial or idiomatic quotes, where we're offsetting a phrase or an idiom of some sort with quotes to denote that it's not a direct quote that requires a citation, but nor is it our own language. If double quotes are used for primary quotes, single quotes should be used for the secondary quotes, ideally to avoid confusion between the two. And inversely, if you're using single quotes for the primary quotes, then you can use double quotes for the secondary quotes. Hopefully that answers all the questions that you might have about when to use quotes, single, double, etc., and the distinction between them. But should you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.